Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
We're trying to get a peace with Russia, Ukraine, and we're working very hard on it. It's a war that should have never started.
Do you expect Zelensky to be involved in these conversations? What will his role be?
I do. He will be involved, yes.
So that was President Trump. His administration has reportedly told European officials it wants a Russia-Ukraine ceasefire by Easter. Where does that leave European leaders? Hello, you're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Welcome to Monday's programme. Now, before being elected, Donald Trump famously predicted it would take him just 24 hours to end the Ukraine war. It's already been somewhat longer than that. The Trump administration now talking about a ceasefire by Easter, which is 9 weeks from now. But all of that is still lightning speed in diplomatic terms. President Trump stunned Europe last week by revealing that he'd agreed with Russian President Vladimir Putin to begin negotiations to end the war in Ukraine. Trump has just accepted to not entirely leave out Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. He will now be included in those discussions, as we heard. Talks with Russia are beginning this week in Saudi Arabia with top officials from the US and Russian sides.
So Europe is racing. France's Emmanuel Macron is holding urgent talks in Paris on Ukraine and the wider continent's security. Investors are anticipating more defence spending in Europe in the bond markets and through defence stocks like Rheinmetall. Here in the UK, Keir Starmer's op-ed in The Telegraph today focused on how the UK could be a bridge between the US and Europe. The Prime Minister sided with the Trump administration on increasing European defence spending, but then, of course, he differed on Ukraine's accession to NATO membership, which he does think should be pursued. So worth considering the UK's unique role now that the transatlantic relationship as we know it seems to have been shredded.
Well, joining us now to discuss is Bloomberg's Europe correspondent-at-large, Alberto Nardelli. Alberto, good to have you with us on the programme. Is this a wake-up call that Europe is just having, or is it a realisation that this shift in position means that something has to be done drastically and quickly?
I think in many ways it is a wake-up call. The main thing that has happened is moving on a very fast time frame. And Europe was hoping to move on a different time frame. So discussions amongst allies first in terms of what security guarantees might look like, put Ukraine in a stronger position before talks, while Trump wants these talks to happen as quickly as possible. And Europe really doesn't have a choice and has to adapt to that time frame now and come up with a tangible plan.
Yeah, the Trump shock. I mean, what does it really mean in terms of greater self-defense, even the idea of sort of military autonomy for Europe? Why has there been so much complacency when the war in Ukraine has been ongoing for 3 years and it's been, years that the US has been sounding these warnings?
I'm not sure I would go as far as saying the continent as a whole has been complacent, in the sense that there are definitely, say, some countries in Western Europe that, even if they are very supportive of Ukraine, they still see the war in many ways something that is far away from them. There are other countries, though, in Eastern and Central Europe that have also been sounding the alarm for quite a while. I think, again, this main issue is the two clashing timeframes. Europe has realized that it has little leverage to influence that timeframe. The timeframe is going to be dictated by Trump, and of course is going to be dictated by what Russia does and says, and by what Ukraine does, because obviously any deal would have to be signed by Ukraine. And Europe has a kind of secondary role in all of that. Even if these are issues which are extremely consequential for Europe. So what Europe is trying to do now is to come up with a plan that fundamentally gives it a voice at the table. But in order to have that voice and that place, it needs to say what it's going to bring to these conversations. And those are the types of discussions Europeans are having right now.
What can they bring? What is the goal in terms of building that position?
There are several things that in theory, Europe could bring. They could stop talking about the need to increase defense spending and actually increase defense spending with a tangible plan and say, this is how we're going to get from A to B. This is how much we're going to invest, and this is what we're going to use that money for. They could put together a package for security guarantees for Ukraine, or at least what Europe's role in those would be. Prime Minister Starmer's announcement that he's prepared to deploy troops to Ukraine is a very good example of something very specific, which other Europeans will be discussing if they can also do that. There are sanctions and sanctions enforcement, which depend on Europe. There are nearly 300 billion euros of Russian central bank assets in Europe. So Europe, in theory, does have potentially and theoretically several levers that it could pull. However, most of these issues, it has so far talked about them, discussed them, but has been unable to reach a tangible position on them. That's what needs to change.
Although there has been an increase in defence spending, in the last few months and year in Europe as a whole, if you look at what has been spent. But yes, it's fascinating, isn't it, that there is now this new world order, and also fascinating because, as you say, Keir Starmer putting Britain at the forefront of that, sort of trying to show the closeness of the UK with the US, talking about how Britain is uniquely placed to advocate for Europe in this situation, pledging to deploy those peacekeeping troops, even though there are doubts about how feasible that would be. He's also due to meet with Trump in Washington, D.C. in a couple of weeks' time. I mean, how feasible is a leadership role for the UK in all of this now?
Two important points on that. One, very quickly though, as a side note, you mentioned spending targets. It's worth pointing out to listeners that most of the increase in defense spending now fundamentally allows European nations to more or less hit targets that they set a decade ago. So they're doing today things that they said they would do 10 years ago. And the targets we're talking about today go well beyond those. They more or less would need to double current spending. In terms of the UK position, it's a very interesting one because on the one hand, yes, it is trying to position itself as a bridge between Europe and the US. But if we look at the specifics of the British position, it is very much rooted in what is a European position. So putting together these security guarantees, pro-Ukraine joining NATO, and Prime Minister Starmer will be in Paris later today to talk with other EU leaders. So more than a bridge between the EU and Europe, he is emerging as a fundamental voice of what is the European position. And all of this beyond, despite the difficulties of the fact that the UK is no longer in the EU. So another trend that we're seeing is, in order to move quickly, many decisions are being discussed and taken outside the formal structures of the European Union.
And that's a very interesting point because the makeup of the group that have been invited to this summit in Paris is the larger EU member states. The UK, as you mentioned, Denmark is in there as well, but other countries not attending. Does that give us a shape of what the future European position will be? And as you point out, with the UK included, despite that being outside the EU?
Absolutely, I think it does. Because if you are looking at a common EU position, which means you would need to find common ground that includes countries that sometimes appear to be batting for the other side, like Hungary, or countries that are neutral, like Malta and Ireland, and they have very different positions on all these issues, it's going to be very difficult to come up with a common position that means significantly more military spending, sending troops to Ukraine, and so on. So what we are seeing is the beginning of a coalition of the willing, which will be made up of a core group of EU member states that, as a side note, goes well beyond the countries at today's meeting, because there are countries in the EU, like, for example, Sweden, the Baltic nations, which have actually provided Ukraine with more military support than some of the countries that are attending today's meeting. So those nations will be central to any debate. And then you have non-EU member states like the UK, but another example is Norway, for example. And so lots of the solutions that will be explored will be determined by this group of European rather than EU countries.
Alberto, lastly, President Trump talking about Putin not having territorial ambitions in Ukraine beyond what he has, or, beyond the Ukrainian borders. How much credibility do Europeans see in that? How much faith do they really have in that view?
Very little would be my answer to that question, because every time Putin has invaded another country, he's always said he never had territorial aspirations beyond the country that he invaded in that moment. We saw similar in 2014 and 2015. And indeed, before that, many years before that, he suggested he didn't have aspirations on Ukraine at all. And there have, of course, been lots of other people throughout history who said that their territorial aspirations were limited to certain parts of the continent, and history shows us that was not the case. So I think most Europeans will not believe much of what Putin says. President Trump does. I mean, obviously he says certain things, but he's also in the midst of a negotiation, so he has to probably balance being tough with Putin and giving the impression that he trusts him. So he kind of has to play that role too.
Okay, Alberto Nardelli, our Europe correspondent-at-large, thank you very much for helping us understand the dynamics at play here as we look ahead to that meeting taking place later on today in Paris between those group of European leaders, including Keir Starmer, and how exactly they'll be looking at the options available to them as they go forward. Yeah, look, the transatlantic relationship and the alliance that has been built up over decades does seem to have been fundamentally shaken after this weekend. So it's really a hugely important moment for Europe and for the UK. Well, that's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe. Give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen. This episode was produced by Tiwa Adebayo. Our audio engineer was Sean Guastamakia. I'm Caroline Hepker. And I'm Stephen Carroll. We'll be back with more on Wednesday. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.